a ghost walked into the surgical ICU of Memorial Hermann Hospital at 3 a.m., disguised in teal scrubs and a surgical mask. His target? A comatose Navy SEAL clinging to life. His obstacle? The veteran night shift head nurse, who knew every heartbeat, every monitor, and every lie on her floor. At 3:14 a.m., the surgical intensive care unit at Memorial Hermann Hospital in Houston was a sanctuary of controlled chaos, wrapped in a deceptive silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic, mechanical sighs of the Puritan Bennett 980 ventilators and the intermittent soft chimes of the Alaris 4 pumps. To an outsider, it was a sterile purgatory. To Evelyn Hayes, the veteran charge nurse with 18 years on the floor, it was her kingdom. She knew the baseline hum of the unit so intimately that a single erratic beep from a telemetry monitor down the hall could pull her out of a dead sleep. Tonight, the tension in the SICU was palpable, centering entirely around bed 4. The name on the patient's chart read John Doe, but Evelyn knew the truth, or at least enough of it. He had been airlifted in 3 days prior from a Black Ops extraction point in Central America. His real name was Garrett Cole, an operator with DEVGRU, the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He had taken 2 rounds from a high-velocity rifle. One shattered his clavicle and punctured his right lung, while the other had grazed his skull, causing a severe traumatic brain injury. He was heavily sedated, intubated, and paralyzed, his life currently sustained by a web of plastic tubing, a propofol drip, and Evelyn's relentless vigilance. For 3 days, 2 heavily armed private military contractors from a firm in Virginia had stood watch outside the glass sliding doors of bed 4. But at 3 a.m., a sudden encrypted call had pulled both contractors down to the hospital's loading dock. They had promised to be gone for 5 minutes, tops. 14 minutes had passed. Evelyn sat at the central nursing station, her eyes flicking from the Epic EMR screen to the telemetry monitors displaying Garrett's vital signs. Heart rate, 68. Blood pressure, 110/70. Oxygen saturation, 99%. Stable. But the absence of the guards gnawed at her instincts. Down the sterile, brightly lit hallway, the double doors of the ICU swung open. Dominic adjusted the ID badge clipped to his teal scrubs. It was a flawless forgery, cloning the RFID signature of a night shift respiratory therapist who was currently tied up with a severe pneumonia case on the 5th floor. Dominic moved with the casual, slightly exhausted shuffle of a hospital worker, halfway through a 12-hour shift. He didn't look left or right. He didn't make eye contact. He just walked with purpose, carrying a clipboard and a small plastic basin of medical supplies. Dominic was not a respiratory therapist. He was a specialist of a different kind, brought in by the same cartel subsidiary that had nearly killed Garrett Cole in the jungle. His contract was simple: ensure the SEAL never woke up to debrief his commanders. Hospitals, in Dominic's experience, were laughably easy targets. The sheer volume of rotating staff, the culture of deference to uniforms, and the exhaustion of the night shift created the perfect camouflage. Tucked inside the pocket of his scrubs was a pre-filled syringe of potassium chloride. Delivered rapidly through a central venous line, the concentrated KCl would overwhelm the heart's electrical system, causing instantaneous cardiac arrest. To a coroner, especially given the trauma the patient had already endured, it would look like a tragic but entirely natural secondary myocardial infarction. No blood, no struggle, no ballistic evidence. Dominic bypassed the break room, nodding briefly at a young resident pouring stale coffee. He turned the corner into the main pod. Bed 4 was right in front of him. The glass doors were slightly parted. He noted the absence of the security detail. His employer's diversion at the loading dock had worked perfectly. From her vantage point at the central station, Evelyn caught the movement in her peripheral vision. She looked up and saw the broad-shouldered man in teal scrubs stepping into Garrett's room. Evelyn frowned. The respiratory therapists assigned to the SICU tonight were Mason and Perez. Evelyn had known them for years. This man was 6'2", with dark hair neatly cropped, and she had never seen him before. Furthermore, respiratory therapists usually checked in at the central station to grab the latest arterial blood gas results before doing their rounds on ventilated patients. This man had walked straight in. Float pool, Evelyn thought, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Hospitals constantly pulled staff from other campuses to cover shortages. It wasn't entirely unusual, but the hairs on the back of Evelyn's neck stood up. In the ICU, intuition was just as crucial as clinical knowledge. She stood up from her chair, her eyes fixed on the glass window of bed 4. Dominic was standing at the right side of the bed. Evelyn watched his hands. If he was respiratory therapy, he should be checking the ventilator screen, listening to breath sounds, or suctioning the endotracheal tube. Instead, Dominic's hands were hovering over the Alaris 4 pumps. He was reaching for the stopcock on Garrett's central line, tracing the lumen that led directly into the SEAL's jugular vein. "What are you doing?" Evelyn muttered under her breath. She stepped out from behind the desk, her clogs squeaking softly against the linoleum. She didn't press the code blue button. There was no medical emergency yet. She didn't call security. She had no proof of anything other than a new employee potentially making a mistake. But her adrenaline spiked. She approached room 4, pushing the heavy glass door fully open. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice sharp, cutting through the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. Dominic froze for a fraction of a second, his thumb resting against the plunger of the syringe hidden in his palm. He smoothly dropped his hands, turning to face Evelyn with a practiced, weary smile. "Hey there," Dominic said, his voice low and casual. "Just doing my rounds." Evelyn stepped into the room, letting the glass door slide shut behind her. The room was bathed in dim blue light, making the clinical space feel almost claustrophobic. She positioned herself at the foot of the bed, placing herself physically between the man and the exit. "I'm the charge nurse tonight, Evelyn," she said, her eyes locked onto his. She scanned his badge. Brandon Webb, respiratory therapy. The photo matched, but the badge looked a little too pristine. "I don't think we've met. You from the Memorial City campus?" "Yeah," Dominic lied effortlessly, keeping his posture relaxed. He leaned slightly against the bed rail. "They floated me over. Heard you guys were short-staffed. Mason asked me to check the vent settings on bed 4. "Mason asked you," Evelyn repeated. Her gaze drifted from his face down to the patient. She looked at the ventilator. The screen was dark. He hadn't touched it. She then looked at the IV pole. Garrett was receiving a complex cocktail of medications. Propofol for sedation, fentanyl for pain, and a low dose of norepinephrine, commonly known as Levofed, to maintain his blood pressure. "So, why were you messing with the IV lines?" Evelyn asked, her tone shifting from casually inquisitive to an icy, authoritative command. Dominic's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. He realized instantly that the woman in front of him wasn't an overworked, oblivious nurse. She was a predator in her own territory. "The tubing was tangled," Dominic replied smoothly. "Looked like the Levofed line was getting kinked. Didn't want the guy's pressure to tank. Just untangling it for you." It was a brilliantly logical excuse for a layman. It sounded professional, attentive, and helpful. But Dominic was not a medical professional, and Evelyn Hayes had spent nearly 2 decades mastering the nuances of critical care. Respiratory therapists are strictly forbidden from touching vasoactive drips like Levofed. It is a cardinal rule of nursing. A kinked Levofed line is a critical emergency, and any RT who noticed one would immediately alert the nurse, not fix it themselves. Furthermore, the Levofed was running through the medial lumen of the central line, which was taped securely to Garrett's neck. It was physically impossible for it to tangle with the ventilator tubing on the opposite side of the bed. He was lying, and he was standing dangerously close to the access port of Garrett's central venous catheter. Evelyn's heart began to hammer violently against her ribs, but her face remained entirely impassive. Panic would get her killed. She noticed the way the man was standing weight perfectly balanced, shoulders square, his right hand partially obscured by the sterile drape on the bedside table. He didn't slouch like a tired healthcare worker. He held himself with the coiled, lethal tension of a spring. "Where the hell are the guards?" she thought. "Oh, I appreciate that," Evelyn said, forcing a tight, professional smile. She took a step closer, moving to the left side of the bed, putting the patient between them. "But I'm actually going to have to ask you to step out. We have a strict protocol for this patient. Nobody touches him without the attending physician present, not even float RTs." Dominic shifted his weight. The hospital was quiet. The door was closed. He calculated the distance between himself and the nurse. 4 feet. He could cross it in half a second, snap her trachea, inject the seal, and be walking out of the stairwell before her body hit the linoleum. "Protocol," Dominic sighed, feigning exasperation. He brought his right hand up, the syringe now concealed cleanly up his sleeve, out of Evelyn's direct line of sight. "Look, Evelyn, I'm just trying to get my rounds done so I can go on break. Let me just check his airway pressure, and I'll be out of your hair." He took a step toward the head of the bed, toward the central line. Stop, Evelyn commanded. She didn't yell, but the sheer force of authority in her voice made it echo in the small room. She reached into her scrub's pocket. Dominic's eyes flicked to her hand, expecting a radio or a phone. But Evelyn wasn't reaching for a phone. In a hospital, screaming for help takes too long. She reached for the heavy-duty trauma shears clipped to her lanyard solid steel, sharp enough to cut through combat boots. It wasn't much of a weapon against a professional killer, but it was all she had. I need you to step away from the patient. Now, Evelyn said, her grip tightening on the shears. Her thumb stealthily pressed the panic button attached to her staff badge. It wouldn't sound an alarm in the room, but it would light up the central security desk downstairs like a Christmas tree, broadcasting a silent staff duress signal with her exact GPS coordinates. Dominic saw the subtle press of her thumb against the badge. He knew what it was. The timeline had just accelerated. He had maybe 60 seconds before hospital security, and possibly Houston PD, swarmed the floor. The charade was over. You're very good, Dominic said, his voice dropping an octave, stripping away the faux-friendly tone. The warm, tired hospital worker vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating void. Most of them just look at the monitors. You actually look at the people. With a flick of his wrist, the syringe dropped from his sleeve into his palm. He lunged forward, not toward Evelyn, but toward Garrett Cole's IV port. Evelyn didn't hesitate. Instinct, honed by years of diving into code blues and wrestling combative trauma patients, overrode her fear. As Dominic reached for the IV port to inject the lethal dose of potassium, Evelyn slammed her forearms down onto the tangled mass of IV tubing, ripping the central line completely out of the manifold with a violent jerk. The monitors instantly erupted in a chaotic symphony of high-pitched alarms. Red lights flashed as the IV pumps screamed, detecting the sudden disconnect. Blood began to well up on Garrett's neck, where the line had violently shifted. No, Dominic snarled. By severing the line, Evelyn had just taken away his fast, clean kill. There was no venous access left to push the potassium chloride. He would have to do it the hard way. Dominic dropped the useless syringe and lunged across the bed at Evelyn. His massive hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her backward against the glass door. The impact rattled the frame, knocking the breath from her lungs. You shouldn't have done that, nurse, Dominic whispered, his grip tightening like a steel vise around her windpipe. Evelyn gagged, her vision swimming with black spots as the oxygen supply to her brain was cut off. But even as she suffocated, her right hand swung up in a vicious arc. The steel trauma shears in her fist drove hard and fast, aiming directly for the soft tissue under the hitman's jaw. The heavy steel blades of Evelyn's trauma shears did not hit the carotid artery, but they did not miss entirely. The serrated edge gouged a deep, jagged laceration along the hitman's jawline, tearing through muscle and grazing the submandibular gland. A spray of bright crimson hit the pristine glass of the ICU door. Dominic let out a guttural hiss, his survival instinct forcing his grip to release Evelyn's throat as his hand flew to his bleeding neck. Evelyn collapsed to the linoleum, her knees hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She gasped, sucking in jagged, desperate lungfuls of the sterile, heavily air-conditioned hospital air. Her vision was completely blurred, the harsh, fluorescent lights above fracturing into blinding white halos. The cacophony of the alarms from Bed 4 was deafening. The Alaris pumps were shrieking their high-pitched, continuous tones, demanding immediate attention for the severed central line, while the Puritan Bennett 980 ventilator sounded a rapid, rhythmic warning as Garrett Cole's airway pressures fluctuated wildly. Dominic recovered in a fraction of a second. The wound was painful, bleeding profusely down the collar of his teal scrubs, but it was not immediately lethal. He looked down at the nurse, gasping on the floor, his eyes dead and unblinking. He didn't have time to punish her. The silent alarm she had triggered was already counting down his window of escape, and the deafening symphony of medical monitors was bound to draw the other nurses from the adjacent pods at any moment. He stepped over Evelyn, moving back to the bed. His primary objective remained the Navy SEAL. Without the central venous line, he could not administer the undetectable potassium chloride. He needed a secondary, immediate method of execution. He reached to his waist, pulling back the hem of his scrub top to reveal a suppressed 9mm Heckler & Koch USP compact tucked into an inside-the-waistband holster. Shooting the patient would be loud, messy, and immediately trigger a hospital-wide lockdown, but it would fulfill the contract. Evelyn saw the dull, matte black finish of the firearm. The sheer terror that should have paralyzed her was instantly incinerated by a profound, furious surge of adrenaline. This was her unit. These were her patients. Nobody died on her watch, unless God himself made the call. As Dominic raised the suppressed weapon, pointing it toward Garrett's sedated, heavily bandaged head, Evelyn lunged from the floor. She didn't go for the gun. She went for the lifeblood of the room, the oxygen tree mounted on the wall behind the bed. She slammed her hand into the flow meter attached to the high-pressure medical oxygen outlet. Connected to the meter was a humidifier bottle and a thick, green plastic tubing used for manual resuscitation. Evelyn grabbed the heavy, solid brass Thorpe tube flow meter and wrenched it sideways with every ounce of strength her exhausted body could muster. The brass fitting snapped off the wall manifold. A deafening, concussive hiss erupted into the room as pure, pressurized oxygen exploded from the wall pipe at 50 pounds per square inch. The force of the gas blasted into the tight space, blowing sterile drapes, medical charting papers, and lightweight supplies into the air like a sudden hurricane. The sheer volume of the sound momentarily disoriented Dominic, causing him to flinch and lower the weapon. "You want to shoot?" Evelyn screamed over the roar of the rushing gas, her voice raspy and broken from the strangulation. "Do it! It's pure oxygen! The muzzle flash will incinerate this entire room!" It was a slight exaggeration of the physical chemistry. Oxygen itself is not flammable, but it is a radical oxidizer that causes anything combustible to ignite with explosive ferocity. A muzzle flash, in an enclosed room flooded with a massive, concentrated plume of pure oxygen, combined with the alcohol-based hand sanitizers, cotton linens, and plastic tubing, would instantly create a catastrophic fireball. Dominic was a professional. He understood physics. He knew she was right. If he pulled the trigger, the resulting flash fire would engulf the bed, the patient, and him. He would burn alive before he ever reached the stairwell. He holstered the weapon, his face twisted, in absolute, murderous rage. He was out of time, out of silent options, and out of patience. If he couldn't shoot the seal, and he couldn't poison him, he would have to crush his windpipe manually, and then he would kill the nurse for the sheer inconvenience of it all. He lunged across the bed, reaching for Garrett's throat, bypassing the thick endotracheal tube that kept the soldier breathing. Evelyn was already moving. When she had snapped the oxygen flow meter, she hadn't just been creating a hazard, she had been opening a pathway. Her right hand swept across the bedside emergency cart. She bypassed the standard medications and grabbed a heavy, red-capped vial and a pre-attached blunt-fill syringe. Succinylcholine. It was a paralytic agent, primarily used in rapid-sequence intubation. It worked by completely depolarizing the skeletal muscles, causing instant, total body paralysis. It didn't stop a patient's consciousness or pain, but it stopped their diaphragm. They would suffocate in minutes without a ventilator. In the ICU, it was a life-saving tool to secure a difficult airway. In Evelyn's hands, it was a chemical weapon. Dominic's massive hands wrapped around Garrett's neck. He squeezed, preparing to crush the cartilage. Evelyn slammed the blunt syringe into the vial, drawing back a massive, lethal dose of the paralytic, far more than the standard milligrams. She didn't bother measuring. She didn't bother tapping out the air bubbles. She simply ripped the needle out, dropping the glass vial to the floor, where it shattered into 100 pieces. She vaulted onto the side of the bed, her knees sinking into the mattress right beside the comatose seal. Dominic looked up just in time to see the wild, bloodshot eyes of the charge nurse looming over him. Evelyn drove the needle blindly into the thick muscle of Dominic's right shoulder. She didn't aim for a vein. An intramuscular injection would take slightly longer to act, but the massive overdose she was pushing would flood his systemic circulation rapidly. She slammed her thumb against the plunger, injecting the entire barrel of succinylcholine directly into his deltoid muscle. Dominic roared, releasing Garrett's throat and swinging his left arm in a brutal backhand. The heavy blow caught Evelyn squarely on the cheekbone. The sickening crack echoed over the hissing oxygen. Evelyn was thrown violently backward, tumbling off the bed and crashing hard against the heavy base of the IV pole. The heavy Alaris pump monitors crashed down, narrowly missing her head. Dominic reached up, ripping the empty syringe from his shoulder. He looked at the plastic barrel, reading the bright red warning label. Warning, paralytic agent. A flicker of genuine panic crossed the hitman's cold eyes. He knew what a paralytic was. He could already feel a strange, terrifying warmth spreading from his shoulder down his arm, followed by a profound, unnatural heaviness. His fingers began to twitch uncontrollably fasciculations, the immediate clinical precursor to total neuromuscular blockade. He had maybe 30 seconds before his diaphragm stopped functioning, and he suffocated in his own body. He abandoned the seal. He abandoned the mission. Survival overrode all other directives. He turned toward the ICU doors, desperate to sprint down the hallway and find an auto-injector of a reversal agent or simply escape the building before his legs gave out. But as he pushed open the heavy glass doors, the reality of Evelyn's silent alarm finally materialized. The double doors at the end of the SICU hallway violently burst open. 4 men surged into the sterile corridor, their heavy tactical boots thundering against the linoleum. They were not hospital security. They were not Houston police. They were the 2 private military contractors, Miller and Collins, accompanied by 2 heavily armed federal agents in plain clothes. The contractors had realized the encrypted call, redirecting them to the loading dock, was a sophisticated spoofing diversion when they found nothing but an empty delivery bay. They had sprinted up 6 flights of stairs, their radios dead to hospital frequencies, but alive to the sudden, chaotic blaring of the room alarms. Dominic stumbled out of room 4, clutching his bleeding neck, his right leg dragging heavily as the succinylcholine rapidly bound to the acetylcholine receptors in his nervous system. His vision was swimming. The hallway felt entirely too long, the bright lights stretching into a dizzying tunnel. "Drop it, on the ground, now!" Miller roared, raising a short-barreled carbine, the laser sight painting a bright red dot squarely on Dominic's chest. Dominic didn't raise his hands. He physically couldn't. The paralytic was working with terrifying efficiency. His knees buckled, the heavy muscle tone vanishing as his skeletal system went entirely flaccid. He crashed hard onto the floor, face first, unable to brace his fall. He lay there, perfectly conscious, perfectly awake, but utterly trapped inside a motionless prison of his own flesh. His lungs began to scream for air as his diaphragm froze completely. He was suffocating, fully aware of his impending death, staring sideways at the glossy white floorboards of the hospital corridor. Miller and Collins advanced swiftly, kicking the suppressed 9mm pistol away from Dominic's waist before aggressively zip-tying his limp wrists behind his back. "Suspect is down. Secure the perimeter," Collins barked into his shoulder mic, stepping over the paralyzed assassin to rush into room 4. Inside the room, it was a war zone of medical supplies. Pure oxygen was still hissing violently from the broken wall manifold. Blood was pooled on the sheets. Evelyn lay slumped against the base of the overturned IV pole, her face bruised and swelling rapidly, her breathing shallow but steady. Collins rushed to the bed. He checked Garrett Cole. The SEAL's central line was disconnected, and his blood pressure was plummeting without the Levofed drip, but his chest was still rising and falling rhythmically with the ventilator. He was alive. 2 other night shift nurses, finally breaking through the confusion, sprinted into the room. "Shut off the main oxygen valve!" Evelyn croaked weakly from the floor, her voice barely a whisper, pointing a trembling finger toward the emergency shutoff panel near the door. "And get a new central line kit. His pressure is dropping." Even battered, bleeding, and concussed, the charge nurse was still running her floor. A nurse scrambled to hit the emergency oxygen shutoff, instantly silencing the deafening roar of the gas. The sudden quiet in the room was jarring, broken only by the persistent, desperate beeping of the cardiac monitor. Collins knelt beside Evelyn, gently helping her sit up. He looked at the massive bruise forming on her cheek, the red marks circling her throat, and the shattered vial of succinylcholine on the floor. He pieced together the scene instantly. This ordinary, middle-aged woman in teal scrubs had just gone hand-to-hand with a professional cartel assassin, and she had won. "You saved his life, ma'am," Collins said, his voice thick with a profound, uncharacteristic reverence. "We left him unprotected, and you held the line." Evelyn leaned her head back against the wall, wincing as the movement pulled at her bruised neck. She looked up at the monitors. Garrett's heart rate was stabilizing as the other nurses scrambled to re-establish intravenous access and restart the critical vasoactive drips. "He's my patient," Evelyn replied simply, her eyes never leaving the flashing green numbers on the telemetry screen. "Nobody dies in my unit." Outside in the hallway, an emergency medical team descended on Dominic. Ironically, the hospital staff were now fighting to save the life of the man who had just tried to end one. They quickly bagged his airway, forcing oxygen into his paralyzed lungs, stabilizing him just enough to ensure he would survive to face federal interrogation. The next morning, the surgical intensive care unit at Memorial Hermann was locked down entirely by federal authorities. The cartel subsidiary that had orchestrated the hit was dismantled within 48 hours, based on the encrypted communication devices recovered from Dominic's pockets. Garrett Cole, the Navy SEAL who had slept through the entire ordeal, finally opened his eyes 3 weeks later. His first sight was not a jungle canopy or an enemy combatant, but the sterile, bright lights of the ICU and the weary, reassuring smile of a nurse named Evelyn Hayes, who was quietly checking his IV lines. He would never fully comprehend the war that had been fought over his hospital bed, but the whispered legends among the security detail ensured he knew exactly who had kept the Reaper at bay. Evelyn adjusted his blanket, made a final note in his electronic chart, and walked out of the room. It was 3:14 a.m. The unit was humming with the quiet, rhythmic sounds of life. For Evelyn, it was just another night shift on the floor. From the tense standoff at the bedside to the explosive chemical gambit that turned the tables, Nurse Evelyn Hayes proved that the most dangerous weapon in an ICU isn't a gun. It's a fierce protector who knows her territory. What did you think of Evelyn's incredible quick thinking under pressure? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment from this intense medical thriller. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this incredible story, and subscribe for more heart-pounding true-to-life dramas.
Hi, my name is Tran Tan, the owner and manager of Noble Tales. After watching the video, a hitman infiltrated the ICU to finish a wounded SEAL. He didn't expect the elite head nurse. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the quiet courage Evelyn showed when every second counted. It reminded me that staying calm, paying attention, and protecting others can make all the difference, even in the most stressful moments. Do you think you would have noticed the small warning signs she caught? And which moment stayed with you the longest? Maybe this story is a good reminder to trust your instincts and never overlook the value of experience. If it meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more.